Hello, my name's Tim Kenny from Tim Kenny Surveying, and as well as being a working residential surveyor, I'm also a lecturer for the University of the Built Environment, generally lecturing around building pathology, which is really interesting for me because I haven't come into this profession from an academic background. I didn't study building surveying at university. Um, my experience, my qualifications are picked up in a very different way, which is great in a lot of ways senses. You can learn a lot through the kind of the more practical experience and brings a different context to it. But there is also a lot of good learning that can be gained from that kind of academic route. And in a weird sort of way, by teaching, I'm also learning quite a bit myself. And in this video, I wanted to share one of the concepts that kind of I've picked up through my teaching, which I think is really interesting. I think it's a really useful tool for surveyors. I think in a lot of ways it kind of represents how a lot of surveyors do approach the assessing of defects. Um, but I think it just puts that into a really nice framework and can be helpful to kind of back up what probably some people already do, or maybe even change how some people approach the assessing of the defects that they may find at a property. Uh, and of course, because I always want to kind of approach these things in a practical, useful way, we're going to look at a specific issue at this specific property. Um, Obviously, you can see there slightly unusual construction, and that's not necessarily going to feed too much into it. But obviously, we've always got to be mindful of these odd forms of construction. They have their own varieties to them. Um, okay, so the process I'm going to be talking about today is DENT. I can never remember what the word is when you make a word out of the letters of first letters of some other words, but whatever one of those is, that's what this is. Okay, and so DENT stands for define, explore, narrow, and test. So I'm not going to kind of claim responsibility for developing this idea. It comes from this really useful book, Understanding Building Failures by James Douglas and Bill Ranson. Okay, chapters 2 and 3 specifically kind of cover this. They cover a lot about say this methodologies for assessing defects, how you actually approach the process of examining a defect and going through the process of trying to work out what it is. And there are different ways of doing it, but I think this is one of the best ones. Certainly the one that I focus on when teaching my students. Okay, so we're going to go through these 4 stages: the defining, the exploring, the narrowing, and the testing. And we're going to look at it in particular in reference to a particular specific defect. And we're going to look at this defect here. So as you can probably see, we've got a bit of staining, a bit of something going on there at the bottom of the stairs. You can just see the kind of the older green paint poking through underneath the handrail. We can see a radiator there. We can see a little bit of disturbance around the skirting board. So we're going to look at kind of what that means. But of course, before we can examine the causes and get really into what we need to do about it, what we might need to find out further, we've really got to know what we're looking at. It seems quite obvious, but actually, when you break it down, it is the only place you can start. Because until you've actually broken down what that defect appears, what you're seeing, what the definition of that defect is, you can't really examine it. I mean, what are you examining before you decide what it is that's there? Okay, so in this case, I would describe it as a damage to plaster and paint finish to a party wall around the base of the stairs and the radiator. We can further define it as having high moisture meter readings to the stained area to approximately 1 meter, and they tail off quickly after that. And we've got a section of loose skirting board. Okay. Now it would be very easy at this point to jump to the definition as damp, but damp is not a definition. Damp is a diagnosis. Okay. The definition here is we have staining, we have damage to the surface here, and we've got moisture meter readings. Obviously, we are cautious about our moisture meter readings. We use them as just one indicator. They're not proof or evidence of damping of themselves, but they give us another pointer, another guide to kind of define the scope of this defect. But of course, we don't just leave our definition there. There is more information available to us in this particular circumstance, and that's kind of what we call the Q acquisition. We gather in all those little nuggets of information that we do when we expect for a defect. We go, okay, what information can I pull in at this stage? What information is available to me as the surveyor in the position I'm in, or whatever the scope of your inspection is? That's what you're going to carry out, and you're going to get that information in. Okay, we're basically going to have a good look round. What we do as surveyors. It's in the term. We survey, we look, we find information. Generally speaking, that's going to be non-invasive. So I'm looking at this from point of view as a surveyor that generally does home surveys. level 2 and level 3, so they are non-invasive, but we can at least have a bit of a dig. In this case, we can pull back the skirting board because the skirting board is loose. And again, that skirting board being loose is another cue for us. It's another kind of little clue as to what might be going on. It's a little bit of information that pulls into that defect to help us understand it. We can also lift the carpet because again, the carpet is not well secured. It's not properly fitted. Again, that's a clue in itself. But it also allows us to gain a little bit more information. So in this case, we can take some moisture meter readings from those timber floorboards, and actually they're dry. They're not reading as damp at all. Now, of course, we don't want to be over interpreting based on the readings from a dry skirting board, dry floorboard, because of course the floorboards can be dry. Joist underneath it in a very different situation can still be damp. But again, it's just one little bit of information that feeds in to that kind of that pile of information we're starting to pull together as we define our defect. So we're now kind of defining it as staining and high moisture meter readings to the wall with a section of loose skirting board and a section of poorly fitted carpet, but no high readings to the floorboards. Okay, so we've now got a little bit more information, a little bit more detail about our defect. Once we've done that, once we've pulled in that available information, all of those little clues, those little nuggets of information that can help us, we can start to explore the defect. Right? And in this context, what we mean by explore is we mean by kind of consider all of the possible causes. We can start to develop some hypotheses for what might have been causing the defect as we have defined it. Okay, so of course, if we are talking about a case of excess moisture or damp, whatever term you want to prefer. So when we're talking about damp, we're going to go through the obvious causes. So firstly, we've got rising damp. I don't want to get into is rising damp a myth? It does exist. In actual fact, rising damp was present at this particular property. Well, it was a great property to do. Every different type of damp you could have was in place at this property. But in this case, we're going to be clear about what rising damp is, and rising damp is groundwater saturating the wall and rising up due to hygroscopic action. Okay, so we're just saying that is a possible cause. We're not yet going into, is it the cause? Is it, how do we exclude it? How do we get into it? We will do that. But at this stage, we're just listing all of the causes. Okay, so we could be penetrating damp. So that's rainwater coming in from outside. Condensation, so obviously moisture in the air condensing on a cold surface, or lack of ventilation to suspended timber floor. My favourite type of damp. I do love a bit of timber floor. I get very excited about timber floors, but this is where we've obviously got water vapour being released from the ground and building up in the subfloor void. Obviously affects the floor. That can also cause damp in walls. And then, of course, we can never forget escape of water. So that is water that is already within the property, within the services of the property, escaping and then affecting the wall. So we've kind of gone through, look, these are all of the possible options. At this stage, we're not trying to narrow that down. We're not trying to exclude things or prove things. We're just saying these are all the options. And this is a really important stage. Even if in your mind you might be thinking, actually, some of these are not that likely, because we have to recognize that defects don't always exist in isolation. Where we do have one defect occurring, then there could be other stuff happening as well. So a classic example is where you do have some form of penetrating damp that's making the wall cold, and therefore condensation is developing as well. So you've got those two effects happening at the same time. And of course, if we just jump to a conclusion, we miss something else. So let's have all of those options and see what we can then do with it when we go through to the next stage. As I said, we want to make sure we are picking up all of the options. We don't want to be excluding stuff at this stage. We want to be mindful of the fact that two defects can happen in the same location. But of course, not every defect is happening. So we do have to start narrowing it down, right? So we can then go through our options and say, okay, well, what are the most likely ones? And again, this is a vital stage of the process. One of the things I quite often say to students is that, mostly as a surveyor, first instance, we don't get to the root cause all the time. We do the initial work, we find the information, we come up with a list of causes, but it is very rare that you will visit a property once and carry out a non-invasive inspection and get to a definitive answer. Might get to a most likely answer. You might narrow it down to you've kind of got very few possibilities, but you don't know that for certain until either the work's carried out or further investigations are done. Right? But we can kind of reasonably eliminate some. So rising damp, I mean, it's possible because it does have some common element, common kind of presentation to what we'd expect from rising damp. So the classic description of rising damp is this kind of tide mark type damp up to about 1 to 1.5 meters, depending on circumstances, with readings tailing off very quickly after that level. And we kind of do have that. You know, it is damp up to 1 meter. They do tail off quite quickly after that. That is some form of presentation of it. Um, it's probably going to be less likely. Obviously, we're on an internal wall, so it's a party wall. That changes things slightly. We're in a property that does have a damp-proof course fitted. In this case, it was a bitumen damp-proof course. We know that damp-proof courses do not fail. They are fairly inert objects sat in a contained environment. They don't fail. Where they do fail, it's because something has directly acted upon them in most cases. Or they've been otherwise bridged. The material itself doesn't fail, whether that's slate, bitumen, or UPVC. These are inert materials. They don't break down in that enclosed environment, so they don't necessarily fail in that way. They obviously can fail because of poor installation, but again, this property is, a good few years old now. That problem would have shown up long before here, and we'd have a much different presentation of it. Next up, obviously, we've got penetrating damp. Well, that one's probably not very unlikely. We're talking about an internal wall here. It's a party wall between two properties. There is no rainwater hitting it. Now, it could be that somebody's throwing water at it from the other side. We can't completely eliminate that. We haven't been round there. As it was, actually, I did go around there because there's some work going on and I was able to get in and have a look. But, for our normal purposes, we wouldn't be doing that. But realistically, that we can comfortably exclude because it is this internal party wall. Condensation. Okay, it's possible, but again, slightly unusual. Internal wall. We're assuming next door is as adequately heated as our property. Therefore, the chance of that being a particular cold spot, very limited. But again, we know if we've got moisture in the wall, we've got the potential for condensation because it's going to make it colder and all of these things. So we can't rule it out. We can't rule out something unusual happening the other side. But it's not the one we're going to really jump to. Lack of ventilation to a suspended timber floor. This is possible. We are looking at a bit of wall that is probably a reasonable distance away from the ventilation. So we're talking about, almost the center of the party wall on the ground floor. The ventilation is always going to be a quite reasonable distance away from that. We know ventilation the air bricks will get blocked, they get obscured, all of these things that can happen over the life of a property. So that has its possibilities. Again, starts to feel a little bit unlikely because of the location of it. It's not a common presentation of that issue, but we're not going to exclude it certainly at this stage because it can exist. And then we come on to probably what I would say would probably going to be the most likely, and that's the escape of water. So we look at the situation of it. We know it's in close proximity to a radiator. We can see that the pipes actually run very close to that area. We can see that some work's been done recently as well. We can see that skirting board was taken off and the carpet was lifted. Those were the clues that we picked up in that process. So that tells us, you know what? Maybe there was something else going on there. Maybe it had leaked previously, or maybe there's an ongoing leak that we can't see and we can't get at this stage. But that, pushing me to saying that bottom one, probably going to be my most likely option. That's the one that I'd want to kind of progress with first, and then we'd move up to the ventilation, and then the other ones, if we prove those weren't viable. But we can do a bit more to exclude them. This is kind of the next stage of our process, is this narrowing down process. So obviously rising damp, we could carry out invasive testing to determine if there's groundwater present. We can have samples taken, we can have testing for salt and all these things that can do it. We can further exclude penetrating damp by having a look at the next door, check what's actually happening the other side of that wall. Again, it's cheap and easy to do, but it's not going to be sort of the most vital one. Condensation, well, we could go for something like thermal imaging. I mean, that section of wall is probably going to be colder because of the damp anyway, so really it's not going to show us an awful lot of use doing that, but it's an option that's available relatively easily. Lack of ventilation, we'll check for air bricks and lift the floorboards to check the joists. We know the carpet's already kind of been partly pulled back. Getting at those floorboards probably not going to be too tricky, so that's a reasonable little test to do. And of course, escape of water. Well, that is in some ways for the surveyor the easiest one to investigate, because we could just say, well, look, let's get a plumber in, go through a test and trace process, and really kind of determine whether there is some water getting out of that system. Important thing is here, we're going to prioritize the simplest and least costly options. Okay, so we've narrowed it down to our most and least likely. And then once we're in that stage, we're going to go for what is the cheapest and easiest to do. Because of course, you're not going to start pulling a building apart for a small issue when there is a cheaper, easier way of doing it. You know, cost does always come into it for many clients, but also there's the disruption of it, and everything else. Okay, so in this case, you know what, the easy ones are getting the plumber in. That's probably the first place to start. It's, yeah, it's relatively cheap. The price of contractors is probably not that cheap, but it is in relative terms relatively cost effective. Um, so I say, we can exclude some, we can kind of narrow it down to our two most likely, and we know that those two most likely have relatively easy testing to confirm them, you know, and that's when we're going to go on to next is our kit testing, you know, and we carry out those tests, get those tests done, get those investigations made. That then kind of brings in more information to you as the surveyor. So, you know, you've got the plumber out, he's gone around and said, no, know what, there's no water getting out of the system, it's all fine. Okay, that's information that's come back to you. And you go, okay, well then we drop back to our next one, which was the subfloor void, the condensation in the subfloor void, lack of ventilation. We go through that process, we open it up and we check it and we check the air bricks and we go through that process. And that'll obviously tell you one way or another whether it's going on there. Um, and chances are one of those two things is going to give you a definitive answer. But of course, if it doesn't, and you've excluded your two most likely, then obviously you're going to go back to the next one. You're going to go up to then condensation. Can we explore more with that one? And then onto the penetrating damp. Can we explore more with that one? And then onto the rising damp. Can we explore more with that one? Okay. And ideally, one of those will give you a definitive definitive answer, or leave you with no other options. So therefore, that's the one that you would progress with. Of course, if it then takes out every single option, you've gone through the whole gamut of what you can think of, then you're going to have to start at the beginning, because it may well be that there is something that an error in your definition of that defect, and you're going to go back and you can start again and go, okay, can I redefine this defect? Have I missed something? You'll then explore it again. You know, what other possible hypotheses are there? Maybe there's something you've missed that you then feed in, and you've got a new idea. And once you've got that new idea, you can then narrow down those ones and pick out any other ones. And maybe you've only just scraped together one. That's fine. And then you test it, and that hopefully then gives you an answer. If it doesn't, then again you go back to the beginning, and you can just keep going through this process until you've got to the best answer you can, and the best advice and the best guidance you can find for your client. I said, hopefully that's useful for you guys. I think it's a really interesting, useful way of approaching defects. It's as I say, it matches how I would normally approach it. It perhaps has taught me a little bit better ways of kind of defining that process, and really kind of understanding kind of almost what's an unconscious process and making that more of a conscious process. Again, really important, because when we think about site notes, when we think about defending or explaining or justifying our opinions and our conclusions, if they ever get challenged, this can be useful for you. So thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you found it useful. Let me know your comments, thoughts, or opinions. Thank you very much.